Tibbs has a poem he wants to read to kick off the program. After Delbert reads that, I'll say a little bit more about voices and then begin that portion of the evening. Delbert.
Thank all of you. I'm very grateful to be here and to lend whatever little voice I might have to the efforts to change things in this country and maybe someday in the world for the better. I have a feeling if we change them here, they will be changed everywhere. One of my heroes is Dr. Martin Luther King. I probably have 5 or 6, and he's one. In my opinion, he was one of the greatest people to have made a contribution to humanity in the last couple of hundred years, anywhere on the planet. But so I wrote a poem for him. It doesn't equal who he was, but it has the flavor of Martin. I call it an oration in celebration of the birth of MLK Jr. Not altogether tongue-in-cheek. Black boy, I say black boy and colored boy and Negro and nigger and uncle and darky and doctor King. Oh, Martin, how well you chose your name. King, a king of a man, a prince, and a prophet just, and nobody knew who you would be growing up down there pretty near like any other colored boy except your daddy was preaching, and you must have been always reaching and touching some sore spot in that South. You must have been always reaching and always teaching too, teaching something like freedom, and you must have always been catching too, something like freedom. Then came time for you to stride the plain. Then came time to command the rain and the star, and the far sun shone in your train, and your reign is eternal and beautiful. Your brain forged a logic, and no lie could stand before it, and you blew it to the ends of this earth and even beyond. You healed the sick and raised the dead. O Martin, you in whom there is no guile. O Martin, hero of the race. Sweet Martin, Jesus Christ like a dark brown Buddha, child of Africa and the West, the best of the fruit of earth, great Son of God. We sing praise now that your birth and life and death and work be forever a beacon to those who love God and those who love man. Thank you.
So the readings you're about to hear are selections from a book that Howard Zinn and I edited called Voices of a People's History of the United States. There's copies of it on sale in the back. You can also get it throughout the weekend at the Haymarket Books Room. And the idea of Voices of People's History of the United States was to create a parallel book to the People's History of the United States that Howard first wrote in 1980, in which he's written a couple of editions updating since that time, to create a book of companion documents, the primary sources of an alternative history, a history of resistance, a history of struggle, a history of fight back, which has been a rich tradition in this country, but a tradition which has been denied, a tradition which has been suppressed, a tradition which certainly the schools and the media don't want us to know about. And so tonight's readings will give voice to just some of those voices of struggle, voices of resistance from our history. Thanks for coming. When Boston capitalists, making use of the new canal system, began building textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts in the early 19th century, they recruited young women from rural New England as their labor force. In response to the harsh conditions in the factories, these young women organized to demand their rights. Here, Harriet Hanson Robinson, who started work in the mills when she was only 10 years old, recalls a strike of the Lowell women in the 1830s.
At the time the Lowell cotton mills were started, the factory girl was the lowest among women. In England, and in France particularly, great injustice had been done to her real character. She was represented as subjected to influences that could not fail to destroy her purity and self-respect. In the eyes of her overseer, she was but a brute, a slave, to be beaten, pinched, and pushed about. One of the first strikes of the cotton factory operatives that ever took place in this country was that in Lowell in October 1836. When it was announced that wages were to be cut down, great indignation was felt, and it was decided to strike en masse. This was done. The mills were shut down, and the girls went in procession from their several corporations to the Grove on Chapel Hill and listened to incendiary speeches from early labor reformers. One of the girls stood on a pump and gave vent to the feelings of her companions in a neat speech, declaring that it was their duty to resist all attempts at cutting down the wages. This was the first time a woman had spoken in public in Lowell, and the event caused surprise and consternation among her audience. Cutting down the wages was not their only grievance, nor the only cause of this strike. Hitherto, the corporations had paid 25 cents a week towards the board of each operative, and now it was their purpose to have the girls pay the sum. And this, in addition to the cut in wages, would make a difference of at least $1 a week. It was estimated that as many as 12 or 1,500 girls turned out and walked in procession through the streets. My own recollection of this strike, or turnout as it was called, is very vivid. I worked in a lower room where I had heard the proposed strike fully, if not vehemently, discussed. I had been an ardent listener to what was said against this attempted oppression on the part of the corporation, and naturally, I took sides with the strikers. When the day came on which the girls were to turn out, those in the upper room started first, and so many of them left that our mill was at once shut down. Then, when the girls in my room stood irresolute, uncertain what to do, asking each other, would you or shall we turn out? And not one of them having the courage to lead off, I, who began to think they would not go out after all their talk, became impatient and started on ahead, saying with childish bravado, I don't care what you do, I'm going to turn out whether anyone else does or not. And I marched out and was followed by the others. As I looked back at the long line that followed me, I was more proud than I have ever been at any success I may have achieved.
Well, children, where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think that twixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North, all talking about rights, the white men will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches, and to have the best place anywhere. Nobody ever helped me into carriages or over mud puddles or give me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? Then they talk about this thing in the head. What's this they call it? Intellect. That's it, honey. What's that got to do with women's rights or Negroes' rights? If my cup won't hold a pint and yours holds a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then that little man over there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down, all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now, they is asking to do it. The men better let them.
Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s eloquence as a leader of the black struggle was unparalleled. Here are selections from one of King's most radical speeches, delivered at the convention of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in Atlanta, Georgia.
Over the last 10 years, the Negro decided to straighten his back up, realizing that a man cannot ride you back unless it is bent. We made an indifferent and unconcerned nation rise from lethargy and subpoenaed its conscience to appear before the judgment seat of morality on the whole question of civil rights. With all the struggle and all the achievements, we must face the fact, however, that the Negro still lives in the basement of the great society. And so we still have a long, long way to go before we reach the promised land of freedom. We must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here. And one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you're raising a question about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. When you ask that question, you begin to question the capitalistic economy. And I'm simply saying that more and more we got to begin to ask questions about the whole society. We're called upon to help to discourage beggars in life's marketplace. But one day we must come to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. It means that questions must be raised. And you see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that's 2/3 water? These are words that must be said. Now, when I say questioning the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them, make them things, and therefore they will exploit them, and poor people generally, economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have to have foreign investments and everything else, and it will have to use its military might to protect them. And all of these problems are tied together. What I'm saying today is that we must go from this convention and say, America, you must be born again. I must confess, my friends, that the road ahead will not always be smooth. There will still be rocky places of frustration and meandering points of bewilderment. There will be inevitable setbacks here and there will be those moments when the buoyancy of hope will be transformed into the fatigue of despair. Our dreams will sometimes be shattered and our ethereal hopes blasted. We may again, with tear-drenched eyes, have to stand before the bier of some courageous civil rights worker whose life will be snuffed out by the dastardly acts of bloodthirsty mobs. But difficult and painful as it is, we must walk on in the days ahead with an audacious faith in the future. Let us realize that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. This is our hope for the future, and with this faith, we will be able to sing in some not too distant tomorrow with a cosmic past tense. We have overcome. We have overcome. Deep in my heart, I do believe we have overcome.
In 1964, Ismael Guadalupe Ortiz helped organize one of the first protests against the use of the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico for U.S. military bombing practice. The struggle continued until 2003, when the movement finally forced the U.S. military to end its use of the island, though the issues of reparations and environmental cleanup of the island remain unsettled. Here is a speech Ortiz gave in 1979 about the struggle in Vieques before being sent to jail for his protests.
My name is Ismael Guadalupe Ortiz. I am 35 years old. All my life, I have lived in Vieques. For the past 13 years, I have been a high school teacher in the public schools. Many years ago, I began to fight for the right of my Viequense brothers to live in peace. Today, I come here not as the accused. I come as the accuser. I accuse the U.S. Navy and the courts of the U.S. in Puerto Rico of conspiring to commit against all Viequenses one of the greatest abuses ever brought against a people in our America. I accuse the U.S. Navy and its legal arm, the federal court, of expropriating and throwing into the street thousands of human beings that live on these lands, and that now this Navy claims is theirs. Who are the witnesses that I call to prove my accusation? To begin with, my own parents were victims of this expropriation. To continue, I call hundreds of Viequenses who are still alive to attest to how it was in the 1940s. Women who had to give birth in cane fields because the birth coincided with the passage of the bulldozers that were knocking down their houses. Of men and women who woke up without a piece of land to cultivate for their own or their family's sustenance. All Viequenses remember the death of Chulto Legrand, a 12-year-old boy, victim of one of the many bombs that the Navy left out on our soil. The elders tell us how the body of Alejandro Rosado was found on the lands occupied by the Navy, buried with his head down and his feet up. The elders tell us about the death of Anastasio and Domingo Acosta, father and son, victims of the Navy's bombs. Juan Maisonet, Elena Holiday, and many more found links in the change of victims, of flesh and blood, and of names and surnames. Nonetheless, today you judge me for getting together with my brothers Viequenses to fight against these injustices committed by the North American Navy in my island of Vieques. As a Viequense, as a Puerto Rican, and as the father of 2 children, I feel legitimately proud to be at the side of my people at this time. That my children will be able to say that I am a prisoner because I do not want Vieques to be for them what it was for me. That I do not want for them or any other child of my small island to be a land bombed and shot at wildly at the whim of foreigners. For my children and for their little friends, the abuses of today will be a thing of the past, or perhaps a lesson in a schoolroom about what happened in Vieques, and never to let it happen again anywhere else. This is why I fight. This court can today send me to prison, but outside remain thousands who will continue the struggle, which is the struggle of all people.
The award-winning journalist Mumia Abu-Jamal has been on death row in Pennsylvania since a 1982 trial filled with procedural errors. Abu-Jamal was a member of the Black Panthers and was well known as a crusading journalist and activist when his case went to trial. Despite appeals from numerous human rights groups for a new trial, international protests, and evidence of his wrongful conviction, Abu-Jamal remains behind bars. From prison, he has recorded a series of radio essays. Here is a reading from 2 of these commentaries.
Don't tell me about the Valley of the Shadow of Death. I live there. In South Central Pennsylvania's Huntingdon County, a 100-year-old prison stands, its Gothic towers projecting an air of foreboding, evoking a gloomy mood of the Dark Ages. As a Black journalist who was a Panther way back in my young teens, I've often studied America's long history of legal lynchings of Africans. I remember a front page of the Black Panther newspaper bearing the quote, "A black man has no rights that a white man is bound to respect," attributed to the U.S. Supreme Court Chief Justice Taney of the infamous Dred Scott case, where America's highest court held that neither Africans nor their free descendants are entitled to the rights of the Constitution. Deep, huh? Look across the nation, whereas of October 1986, blacks constituted some 40% of men on death row, or across Pennsylvania, where as of August 1988, 61 out of 113 men, some 50%, are black, to see the truth, a truth hidden under black robes and promises of equal rights. Blacks are just 9% of Pennsylvania's population, just under 11% of America's. As I said, it's hard to shrug off, but maybe we can try this together. How? Try out this quote I saw in a 1982 law book by a prominent Philadelphia lawyer named David Carries. Law is simply politics by other means. Such a line goes far to explain how courts really function. Whether today or 130 years ago in the Scott's case, it ain't about law, it's about politics by other means. Now, ain't that the truth? Perhaps we can shrug off and shred some of the dangerous myths laid on our minds like a second skin, such as the right to a fair and impartial jury of our peers, the right to represent oneself, the right to a fair trial even. They're not rights. They're privileges of the powerful and the rich. For the powerless and the poor, they are chimeras. that vanish once one reaches out to claim them as something real or substantial. Don't expect big networks or mega chains of Big Mac media to tell you, because of the incestuousness between the media and the government and big business, which they both serve. They can't. I can. And I will continue to fight against this unjust sentence and conviction. The time is right for a new, brighter, life-affirming vision that liberates, not represses the poor, who after all are the vast majority of this earth's people. Neither serpentine politics nor sterile economic theory that treats people as mere economic units offers much hope. For the very politicians they vote for spit in their faces while economists write them off as non-persons. It must come from the poor, a rebellion of the spirit that reaffirms their intrinsic human worth based upon who they are rather than what they possess.
Rachel Corey, a student at Evergreen College and a member of the Olympia Movement for Justice and Peace, traveled to the Gaza Strip in Palestine in early 2003 as a volunteer with the International Solidarity Movement. On March 16, 2003, she was killed when she was run over by a Caterpillar bulldozer while trying to block the destruction of a Palestinian home. The bulldozer was driven by an Israeli, but built in the United States. The driver could not have failed to see Corey, who was wearing a bright orange jacket and who announced her presence through a bullhorn. After her death, Corey's family and friends released copies of her moving letters describing the struggle against the U.S.-backed occupation of Palestinian lands. Here's one of the letters she sent home.
Hi, friends and family and others. I have been in Palestine for 2 weeks and 1 hour now, and I still have very few words to describe what I see. It is most difficult for me to think about what's going on here when I sit down to write back to the United States, something about the virtual portal into luxury. I don't know if many of the children here have ever existed without tank shell holes in their walls and the towers of an occupying army surveying them constantly from the near horizons. I think, although I'm not entirely sure, that even the smallest of these children understand that life is not like this everywhere. An 8-year-old was shot and killed by an Israeli tank 2 days before I got here, and many of the children murmur his name to me, Ali, or point at the posters of him on the walls. The children also love to get me to practice my limited Arabic by asking me, Kaif Sharon? Kaif Bush? And they laugh when I say, Bush Majnoon, Sharon Majnoon, back in my limited Arabic. How is Sharon? How is Bush? Bush is crazy. Sharon is crazy. Of course, this isn't quite what I believe, and some of the adults who have the English correct me. Bush mish Majnoon. Bush is a businessman. Today I tried to learn to say Bush is a tool, but I don't think it translated quite right. But anyway, there are 8-year-olds here, much more aware of the workings of the global power structure than I was just a few years ago. Nevertheless, no amount of reading, attendance at conferences, documentary viewing, and word of mouth could have prepared me for the reality of the situation here. You just can't imagine it unless you see it. And even then, you are always well aware that your experience of it is not at all the reality. What with the difficulties the Israeli army would face if they shot an unarmed U.S. citizen, and with the fact that I have money to buy water when the army destroys wells, and the fact, of course, that I have the option of leaving. Nobody in my family has been shot driving in their car by a rocket launcher from a tower at the end of a major street in my hometown. I have a home. I am allowed to go see the ocean. When I leave for school or work, I can be relatively certain that there will not be a heavily armed soldier waiting halfway between Mud Bay and downtown Olympia at a checkpoint with the power to decide whether I can go about my business and whether I can get home again when I'm done. As an afterthought to all this rambling, I am in Rafah, a city of about 140,000 people, approximately 60% of whom are refugees, many of whom are twice or 3 times refugees. Today, as I walked on top of the rubble where homes once stood, Egyptian soldiers called to me from the other side of the border, "Go! Go!" because a tank was coming, and then waving and, "What's your name?" Something disturbing about this friendly curiosity. It reminded me of how much, to some degree, we are all kids, curious about other kids. Egyptian kids shouting at strange women wandering into the path of tanks. Palestinian kids shot from the tanks when they peek out from behind walls to see what's going on. International kids standing in front of tanks with banners. Israeli kids in the tanks anonymously, occasionally shouting and also occasionally waving. Many forced to be here, many just aggressive, shooting into the houses as we wander away. I've been having trouble accessing news about the outside world here, but I hear an escalation of war on Iraq is inevitable. There is a great deal of concern here about the reoccupation of Gaza. Gaza is reoccupied every day to various extents, but I think the fear is that the tanks will enter all the streets and remain here instead of entering some of the streets and then withdrawing after some hours or days to observe and shoot from the edges of the communities. If people aren't already thinking about the consequences of this war for the people of the entire region, then I hope you will start.
Military families have played a vital role in the struggle to end the occupation of Iraq. Here is the text of an open letter from Maritza Castillo, the mother of Camilo Mejia, and 19 other relatives of National Guard members sent to fight in Iraq. The letter was sent to Colonel Michael G. Jones of the Florida Department of Military Affairs.
Dear Colonel Jones, we, the relatives of the Florida National Guard soldiers, want to express our position in relation to the last postponement of the return of our soldiers back home. We want to inform you that we are united in the fight for the return of our soldiers. This letter shall serve to remind you that these soldiers have now been away from our homes for 8 months, away from their children, wives, parents, away from their universities and jobs, involved in a guerrilla war in an unknown country, not knowing the culture or the language of the place, menaced by mines, bombs, and guns, risking their lives 24 hours a day, standing in their uniforms and carrying their equipment in temperatures of up to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. In less than 3 months, this small company has suffered countless attacks, leaving 4 soldiers crippled and another soldier in coma. The National Guard soldiers are civilian, not active duty members of the Army, They have never received the training for combat in the desert or to face urban guerrillas. We know that since their arrival, our young soldiers have been patrolling and searching the houses of presumed guerrilla forces. We know that they lack adequate equipment, that in many cases they have patrolled without bulletproof vests and without the necessary ammunition to face the guerrilla forces. Isn't this enough? How many months, how many abuses are we supposed to endure? We will not mention each suffering and difficulty that our soldiers have endured. We just want to tell you that we know that what they are going through and that we will not keep quiet in the face of this dishonor. We will not rest until our young soldiers come back to our homes. We are determined to continue on this campaign to the end. If necessary, a group of mothers will go on an indefinite hunger strike. You will not only be responsible for the lives of our soldiers, but for that of their mothers. We shall not accept political apologies, lack of governmental will by President Bush to work together with the United Nations and to restore the power to the Iraqis is the reason why the participation of an international force comprised by big nations is not possible. The coalition we are told about does not really exist. It is our troops that carry the load of this war. It is our children who are being sacrificed due to an arrogant and unfair attitude. For this and for other reasons, we demand the return of our soldiers now. We shall not abandon our loved ones. We shall not abandon our troops. We shall continue demanding their return day by day, street by street, door to door. We will ask the world to join us. We will not abandon our fight until our soldiers are back in our homes.
Our readers tonight were Darby Tillis, Cindy Corey, David Natal, Camila Mejia, Roberto Barreto, Kirsten Green, Kienga Taylor, Brian Jones, Marlene Martin, Monique Matthews, Paul D'Amato, Alice Kim, Delbert Tibbs, Nina LaBoy, and Dow Tran. Thanks a lot.